April 1487. A banquet hall in Wallachia. 200 noblewomen sit beside their husbands, dressed in silk, drinking wine, celebrating Easter. By sunrise, their husbands will be dead, impaled in the courtyard. And these women, these daughters of aristocrats, who had never touched dirt in their lives, will begin a death march to the mountains. One of them was named Voica, 23 years old, married for 2 years. Her hands had never held anything heavier than a wine cup. Within a week, those hands would be raw meat, nails torn off, bones visible through the skin, dragging stones up a cliff to build a castle for the man who murdered her husband. She worked until the clothes rotted off her body, until there was nothing left to cover her, until she couldn't tell her own blood from the rocks she carried. Voica was one of 200. Most of them died on that mountain, and this was just the beginning. What Vlad Dracula did to women was not a side effect of war. It was the strategy, it was the message, it was the point. He impaled mothers next to their daughters. He had wives flayed for failing to sew a proper shirt. He turned female bodies into warnings so horrifying that the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, the man who conquered Constantinople, took one look and turned his army around. Hollywood gave you a vampire who seduces women in castles. History gave you a monster who destroyed them in public squares. This is what really happened. Not to Vlad, to them. To the women history decided you should never know about. History remembers the monster. It forgets the victims. That's what we're here to fix. This is Crown and Dagger. If you want to support the channel, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let me show you where this darkness came from, and why Vlad believed that destroying women was the key to absolute power. But where did this come from? Why women? Vlad spent 6 years as a child hostage in the Ottoman Empire. He watched, he learned. Terror was a tool, bodies were messages, and the fastest way to break a society was to break its women. When he returned to Wallachia, his father was dead. His older brother had been tortured and buried alive, betrayed by the very nobles they trusted. The boy who left was gone. What came back was something else. A man who believed controlling women meant controlling everything, and punishing women meant sending messages no one could ignore. So that's exactly what he did, starting with the wives of the men who killed his family. Easter Sunday, 457, Târgoviște. The noble families of Wallachia have gathered at Vlad's palace for a feast. Boyars in their finest robes, their wives glittering with jewels, their families filling the halls with laughter. They think this is a celebration. They're wrong. During the banquet, Vlad stands and asks one question. How many princes have you known in your lifetime? Nervous laughter. Even the youngest noble has seen 7 rulers come and go. The oldest has witnessed 30, each one betrayed, each one murdered, each one replaced by another puppet. Vlad nods slowly. That is the problem. The doors slam shut, guards pour in. Within minutes, the old boyars are dragged outside and impaled in the courtyard. The screams echo through the stone walls. Voica hears her father-in-law begging for mercy, then silence. But for the young nobles and their families, Vlad has different plans. Still wearing their Easter silk, the wives and daughters are chained together. Voica feels the iron close around her wrists, so tight it cuts skin. Her guard shoves her forward. She falls. The woman beside her helps her up. Before they march, Vlad makes them watch. Their husbands raised on stakes in the courtyard. Some die quickly, some don't. Voica finds her husband in the forest of bodies. He's still alive, still calling her name. She can't go to him. She can't look away. Then the march begins, 50 miles north, through forests, through mud, through rain. No food, no rest. Women who had travelled their whole lives in carriages now stumble barefoot over rocks. Some collapse on the first day. The guards don't stop. They drag them. When dragging becomes too slow, they leave them behind. The wolves do the rest. When they finally reach the ruins of Poenari Castle, Vlad is waiting. You will rebuild this fortress with your hands. According to the Cantacuzino Chronicle, They worked for months. The silk dresses went first, torn by stones, soaked with blood, rotted by rain. Then the undergarments. Soon there was nothing left on their bodies. 200 noblewomen exposed to the sun and cold, carrying rocks up a mountain with their bare hands. Voika's hands split open on the third day. By the second week, she couldn't feel them anymore. The woman beside her, a countess who had never lifted anything heavier than embroidery, fell from the cliff on day 12. Her body tumbled down the rocks. No one was allowed to stop. No one was allowed to look. At night, they slept on bare stone. No blankets, no shelter, huddled together for warmth like animals. The mountain cold cut through their broken bodies. Some women didn't wake up. Their bodies were dragged aside and the work continued. They ate what the guards threw at them. Scraps, bones with bits of meat still clinging to them. Water from puddles. Women who once had servants to pour their wine now fought over muddy rainwater. The chronicle says many died from exhaustion. Others fell from the cliffs. Some simply sat down on the stones and refused to move until the guards beat them to death. A few tried to escape. They were caught within hours and impaled in front of the others. A reminder that death was not an escape Vlad would grant easily, and Vlad watched from above. When the castle was finally finished, only a handful of women remained alive. They were kept as servants, in the very fortress they had built with their bleeding hands. Their noble titles erased, their families gone. They would spend whatever remained of their lives climbing the same stairs that had destroyed them. But here's what makes this worse. Poenari wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about justice. It was about theatre. Vlad wanted every noble family in Wallachia to know what happened to the women of his enemies. He wanted wives to look at their husbands and wonder, if he falls from favour, will I be next? The noble women of Poenari weren't just victims. They were a message. And the message was received. But Vlad wasn't finished with the women of his own kingdom, because building a castle was punishment for the wives of traitors. For ordinary women, the rules were even more terrifying. If you were a woman in Wallachia between 1456 and 1462, you lived in constant terror. Not of war, not of disease, of being noticed. Vlad believed women were the foundation of society. A wife who failed her husband was a crack in that foundation, and cracks had to be sealed with blood. There's a story in the German pamphlets from the time. A peasant man walked through a village wearing a shirt that was too short. His legs were visible. In Vlad's Wallachia, this was not just embarrassing, it was evidence. Vlad stopped him on the road. "Do you have a wife?" The man said yes. "Bring her to me." She came. A woman named Ilinka. Strong hands. She had probably spent her whole life working, cooking, cleaning, raising children, sewing when there was time. Vlad looked at her with the same expression he used for inspecting cattle. "Why does your husband walk around dressed like a beggar? Is there no flax in your home? Are your hands broken?" She tried to explain. The children needed care. The farm needed work. There wasn't enough time. There was never enough time. Vlad's response was immediate. What they did to her lasted hours. The village was forced to watch. When it was over, what remained of her was raised on a stake in the square. Her body left there for days, a warning no one could ignore. Then Vlad found another woman for the widowed peasant. He looked at her and spoke slowly, so everyone in the village could hear. "Make sure his shirt is longer, or you'll share her fate." This was the law in Vlad's Wallachia. Not written in books, written on bodies. Adulterous wives were flayed in front of their families. Their husbands forced to watch. Widows who remarried too quickly were impaled. Their bodies displayed at crossroads. Women who failed to meet his standards faced punishments the chronicles refused to describe in detail. One account describes a woman accused of being unfaithful. Vlad ordered her taken to the square. What they did to her body took hours. The crowd was forced to watch. When it was over, what remained was raised on a stake as a warning. The message was absolute. Your body does not belong to you. It belongs to your husband, to your family. to the prince. Fail any of them, and the punishment will be beyond imagination. Women stopped leaving their homes unless necessary. Wives checked their husbands' clothing obsessively, terrified of a loose thread or a short hem. Mothers taught daughters that survival meant one thing: be invisible. This was not the reign of a vampire. This was the reign of a man who understood that the fastest way to control a population was to terrorize its women. Was Vlad a product of his brutal times, or something worse? Tell me what you think in the comments. But before you decide, let me show you what he did to the women of his enemies. Winter 1462. Vlad has crushed the boyars. His own people are frozen with fear. Now he turns south, toward the Ottoman Empire. This isn't a war of conquest. Vlad doesn't have the army for that. This is a war of messages, and he's going to write those messages on the bodies of the innocent. He crosses the Danube with his troops and moves through Ottoman territory village by village. What he leaves behind is silence. In a letter to King Matthias of Hungary, dated February 11th, 1462, Vlad wrote with the precision of an accountant. 23,884 Turks and Bulgarians were killed, not counting those burned in their homes or whose heads were not presented to our officers. Entire families. No one was spared. But the killing was only the beginning. The survivors were gathered for something special. Picture a Bulgarian village on the Danube. The initial attack is over. The men who resisted are dead. The survivors, mostly women and their families, are herded into the town square. They expect slavery. Slavery is what conquerors do. Slavery would be mercy. Instead, the stakes come out. A mother clutches her daughter. Soldiers grab them both. They don't separate them. That would be too easy. Vlad wants families to die together. He wants mothers to watch. He wants daughters to hear. The stake isn't sharp. It's rounded, greased with oil. Designed not to kill quickly. Designed to let the body's own weight do the work. Slowly, over hours, sometimes days. The mother watches her daughter raised into the air. She hears sounds that will echo in her skull until her own death, which comes minutes later, on the stake beside her. When Ottoman scouts arrived days later, they found what one chronicler called a forest of the impaled, bodies arranged by height. The tallest stakes held the most important captives. Families hung together. That was the point. Some were still alive, their bodies moving slowly in the wind. And this was one village. Vlad did this along the entire Danube. Dozens of villages, thousands of bodies. The river itself was said to be stained for miles. By June 1462, Sultan Mehmed II had seen enough. He gathered the largest army in the world, 100,000 men, and he marched toward Wallachia to end Vlad once and for all. But Vlad had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Outside Targoviste, the Ottoman army stopped. The soldiers in front began to scream. Some turned and ran. Others fell to their knees. The Sultan rode forward to see what had broken his army. In front of him stretched a field, nearly a mile long, half a mile wide, and in that field, raised on stakes of varying heights, were 20,000 bodies, entire families, together. The Byzantine historian Laonikos Chalkokondyles was there. He wrote, "There were large stakes on which about 20,000 men, women and children had been spitted. Quite a sight for the Turks and the Sultan himself. Imagine being one of those women, still alive, feeling your body slowly giving into gravity, watching the largest army in the world arrive and knowing that even they cannot save you, that your death is not a tragedy to be mourned, but a message to be read. Some bodies had been there for weeks, rotted beyond recognition. Others were fresh, still bleeding. A few were still alive, their bodies twitching in the summer heat. The smell reached the Ottoman army before they could see the field. Soldiers who had conquered cities vomited at the sight. Mehmed, the man who conquered Constantinople, who ended an empire that had lasted 1,000 years, who had walked through more blood than any ruler alive, stared at the field of corpses and made a decision. He turned his army around and left. According to Chalka Condyles, the Sultan said, "It is not possible to deprive of his country a man who does such great deeds and who can exploit his kingdom and his subjects in this way." It wasn't admiration. It was surrender dressed in diplomatic language. Vlad had won, and the price of victory was paid in the bodies of mothers and daughters. The Sultan left. The women stayed on their stakes. Vlad had won. But there was one more woman in this story, the one closest to him, and her ending was the darkest of all. She has no name in the history books. We know her only as Vlad's first wife, spring 1462. The Ottomans have retreated, but Vlad's brother Radu is leading a new army toward Poenari Castle, the same castle built by the hands of noblewomen 5 years earlier. Vlad's wife stands on the battlements. Below her, the Argesh River crashes against the rocks. Behind her, the castle her husband built on the bones of women. In front of her, an army carrying Ottoman flags. She knows what happens to captured women. The harems, the slavery, a life of degradation. But she also knows what her own husband does to women. She's lived in his world. She's seen the stakes. She's heard the screams. She's walked the halls of a castle built by women who died carrying stones. She's trapped between two monsters. According to local legend, she turned to her servants and said 7 words. "I would rather be food for the fish of the Argesh than a prisoner of the Turks." And she jumped. Her body fell hundreds of feet into the river below. The water swallowed her without a trace. Today, that river is still called Raoul Douamne, the Ladies' River. Vlad escaped through a secret passage. He would spend 12 years in a Hungarian prison, marry again, and eventually die in battle in 1476. His head was sent to Constantinople, where the Sultan displayed it on a stake. The man who lived by the stake died by the stake, but his wife had already escaped the only way she could. Vojka, building a castle until her hands were bones. Ilinka, destroyed for a shirt that was too short. Thousands of nameless mothers, raised on stakes beside their daughters. And a wife with no name, choosing a river over 2 different kinds of hell. These are the women of Vlad Dracula's reign, not seduced, not bitten, not romanticized, destroyed. Hollywood needed a monster that was sexy, a villain you could secretly root for, a darkness that was thrilling, not disturbing. So they gave you capes and castles and eternal life. The real Dracula offered none of that. He offered stakes and screaming, and women used as parchment for messages written in blood. And here's the uncomfortable truth that history doesn't want to teach you. It worked. For 6 years, a kingdom smaller than some modern cities held off the greatest empire on earth. Not through diplomacy, not through military genius, through cruelty so absolute, so theatrical, so specifically targeted at women and families that even the Sultan couldn't stomach it. Vlad proved something dark about power, that there is a level of horror so extreme that it becomes its own kind of strength. That the fastest way to break your enemies is to break the women they love. The question isn't whether Vlad was evil. History is full of men who killed more. The question is why we turned him into a romantic figure. Why we gave him a cape and fangs and a castle full of candles. Why we made him seductive instead of horrifying. And why we forgot the names of the women he destroyed. Because that's what we do. We remember the monsters. We build legends around them. We write books and make movies and sell merchandise with their faces on it. And the victims, they become statistics, background noise, nameless bodies in a story that was never really about them. Vojka deserves to be remembered. Her hands bled so a monster could have a fortress. Her suffering built walls that tourists photograph today. So does Ilinka, who died because a shirt was too short. So do the mothers of the Danube, who held their daughters as the stakes went up. So does the nameless wife, who chose the river over a world where women had no choices at all. They didn't choose to be part of this story. They didn't choose to become messages, warnings, examples, but they were. And the least we can do is remember them. If you made it this far, hit subscribe. Today, tourists climb the 1,480 steps to Poenari Castle. They take selfies at the top. They buy Dracula t-shirts in the gift shops. They post photos with captions about